All right, so today's video is going to be a response to Revival Fitness. He posted a video the other day, and in this video, I haven't seen the full thing through, but I've seen most of it. There's a couple things that stick out to me that I think warrant a response. Of course, I'm going to try and keep this as civil and information-oriented as possible. I'm not in this for personal beef, as you guys know. I'm purely here just to discuss lifting topics. But there were a few takes in here that were definitely pretty condescending, self-limiting, and overall, I would say just a bit nihilistic in a way. So one of the major issues that he points out, which I do agree with him on, is there's some people he calls hypertrophy cells. And that's a pretty just mean thing to say. I don't agree with using a term like that. I think you should probably respect what people want to train for, whether you understand it or not. I will critique powerlifting or power building methods for hypertrophy all day, but if someone wants to train for power building or powerlifting, whether I understand it or not, I will 100% respect that. With his takes, I don't appreciate how he comes across to people that train purely for hypertrophy. Recreational bodybuilders or bodybuilders, they're the same thing in my opinion. He doesn't seem to think so. He thinks you have to compete to call yourself a bodybuilder. Minor little disagreement. That's not the point of this video. But I think overall, with his points, he has a major critique of what he would call hypertrophy cells, who in his definition are the people that are much smaller than they appear on social media. They'll use different methods of Photoshop or editing or the perfect camera, perfect lighting, get a crazy pump, etc., to make them appear like they're much bigger than they are. And I have an issue with this too. I mean, at the end of the day, it's fine to do, I guess, but these people are very misleading and they straight up just give people body dysmorphia at worst. So I do have an issue with these people. However, he also critiques the Noble Natty community quite a bit, especially in the comments section where he refers to us as fake natties and actually calls out GVS as a fake natty and says that he's surprised that the rest of us don't call him out for being a fake natty. So it's one of those things where he'll critique the people that pretend to be a big natural lifter, but then when there is a group of big natural lifters, now we're just fake naturals. So it's like, you can't have your cake and eat it too. And I think that's the main issue I had with this video. So it's just a bit disappointing to see that now that there finally is a community of us that make videos that are relatively big natural lifters, that we just get fake natty accusations. And it's not like we're even in this purely for ourselves or just to like show off our physique and brag and stuff. Like, we're all here posting informative content. And we don't even use filters. I have an iPhone for my camera, and I've had the channel for nearly 2 years. My video is always blurry. I have no downlighting in my gym. It's all just washed out, plain lighting. It makes me look smaller than I actually am. So to see channels like mine, where it's always information oriented. We don't use fancy lighting or filters or get crazy pumps for anything, or let alone Photoshop. I think this is exactly what we need, and I think he's misleading a lot of people by calling physiques like ours not attainable because we're fake naturals. I disagree with him heavily on that. So with that intro getting out of the way, let's dive into the actual video. I'm going to put it at 1.5 speed so you don't have to sit through the entire thing because it is rather long.
Chest up, shoulders back. This is Revival Fitness. This has been happening for a number of years now as the hypertrophy culture has completely taken over the lifting scene, but power building is under attack. All of these gripes against it ultimately aren't legitimate. It is not like you can't get really big and build all these giant muscles and also not get very strong at the same time. In fact, that used to be normal. It seems to me that only in the past decade or so, people say things like, well, I don't care how much I can bench or deadlift or squat or whatever exercise you're referring to. I just want to look like I can. Maybe I'm the first one to tell you this, but for the vast majority of you, you're going to have to actually bench that much to look like you can bench that much.
So this is a bit of a straw man. Nobody's saying that as you get bigger, you're not going to get stronger. People are just saying, and if you listen to our arguments, somebody like myself is saying, when you chase an arbitrary strength standard in the big three on lifts that you can cheat heavily and get much stronger at than you do get size gains in return, that's not a productive way to train for hypertrophy. you don't actually have to hit a specific number. You just have to milk a certain amount of stimulus. Growth comes from mechanical tension, and that's how you get bigger. You don't get bigger from hitting a certain number that's relatively arbitrary in terms of strength standards. So it's nobody's saying that you're going to just get huge and then not be strong. You're just going to be strong as much as you need to challenge your muscle in your desired rep range, in your desired proximity to failure.
Because you max out on your bench, even on a pretty regular basis, your muscles are not going to start melting away, and you're not going to sacrifice muscle gain just because you're doing so. So before we dive into everything, let's just discuss the term power building itself.
Yeah, so nobody's saying that if you squat, bench, deadlift, and you train for power building, you're just going to wither away and all your muscles are going to just die off. I think he's saying this partially ironically. I think he's over-exaggerating on purpose, which is, it's whatever. It's at the very least, it's funny. I don't think he understands how big you can get naturally, and that's why I think that he thinks that kind of like an intermediate type physique is as big as you can get naturally, because clearly he thinks anybody bigger than that is just a fake natty. So I don't think he fully understands that you do need more specific training to actually reach your natural potential, if you believe that's even a thing. For me personally, I do believe there is somewhat of a natural limit, but I don't think you can get there just without a very in-depth understanding of lifting, or at least having a coach that can guide you through that. It's one of those things where you look at specific cases where, of course, there's going to be people that can get away with minimalist training and probably reach their natural limit. There's people that are just gifted like that are hyper responders, and that's fine. But if you look at someone like myself, where I've made this case before, people say I have good genetics. I disagree a little bit. I think I just have average genetics, but if I was able to reach these standards and get very strong and stronger than Revival too, but I was still pretty small relative to my strength, and I was plateaued in size in a decent amount of muscle groups, I think it's safe to say that I wouldn't have reached my natural potential through that style of training. You could also make the case that, well, maybe I did reach my natural potential and my genetics weren't good, and I just wasn't able to get beyond anything that would be an intermediate physique according to most people. To counter this, I would say, look at the past year or two. My arms are up 1.5 inches since my peak power building days. They're at 17.5, and I'm willing to bet that they'll be at 18 in a few months to a year tops. Like that's a major difference. That's the difference between an intermediate physique and like an advanced, I'm not going to say elite natural physique, but when you get to numbers that are above 16 inches for arms, just a random example, every little quarter of an inch you can get makes a huge difference. And I think Revival doesn't understand how big you can actually get naturally, clearly, because he calls someone like GVS a fake natty, to where someone like me, and I think most people in the noble natty community, I think it's painfully obvious that he actually is natural.
Because this term really has no true meaning, right? It is an iteration of multiple fitness activities. It originally spawned as a combination of powerlifting and bodybuilding, even though the vast majority of people who use this term are not powerlifters nor bodybuilders. I will die on this hill, guys. I'm going to say this till I'm blue in the face, especially when it pisses some of you guys off, because you deserve to be mad by it. You're not a bodybuilder just because you build muscle. If you have never planned to step on a stage, until you do, you're not a bodybuilder. And likewise, even if you max out on the squat, bench, and deadlift routinely, until you put on the singlet and go to a meet, you're not a powerlifter. You can get mad and call that gatekeeping. There's no gatekeeping. These things are open entry. You pay the fee, you go to the competition of your choosing. There's no gatekeeping here. It's simply defining what these things are, because they are organized competitive events. You taking mirror selfies in your bathroom and going to the commercial gym or lifting in your garage, you don't qualify, buddy. I'm sorry. But this is where things get tricky.
So this I do tend to disagree with quite a bit, because one, powerlifting and bodybuilding, more specifically bodybuilding, I kind of see it as a bit of a money grab. You can say that's nihilistic or whatever, but I was looking to doing a show a few years ago, actually back when I was power building. It was going to be like nearly $2,000 for everything, for like the tan, the shorts, the entry fee, whatever else you have to buy. There is quite a few costs to enter something like this. Money grab aside, finances aside, the standards for natural bodybuilding are absurd and counterproductive. these organizations have hijacked what bodybuilding is to turn it into something that's as entertaining as they possibly can, because when you're as shredded as you can, that's what the fans like to see. Bodybuilding, in what it should be, has been hijacked by these organizations. So I don't see why a federation that hosts bodybuilding events that have their lifters and their bodybuilders come in at unhealthy standards, especially naturally, enhanced is a whole other story about health. But I don't see how that can determine if you're a bodybuilder or not. That doesn't really make much sense. And bodybuilding is ultimately about building your body. How much muscle can you build? It doesn't matter if you compete against someone else's standards. And on top of that, they're subjective. Like, it's not like even powerlifting, at least it's not subjective. Powerlifting is at least numbers. Bodybuilding is literally someone else's opinion on how they think you're doing, to an extent, which, call me crazy, but I think you can be a bodybuilder and not compete.
Because when it comes to bodybuilding, or the building part of power building, that is very vague because you can build muscle doing pretty much any exercises that you really want to. The power part, everybody likes to conflate so-called strength, right? You see these guys all the time say, I train for hypertrophy, not strength. There is this very, very weird assumption that talking about strength training automatically means powerlifting. Strength does not mean that. I don't know where you guys came up with this idea. I don't know if it's because throughout the years, a lot of people that talk about strength do compete in powerlifting. Maybe that's why they get so attached to each other. But discussing strength and talking about getting stronger can refer to any exercise, any rep range. It is not exclusive to only the power lifts. The term power building really came to fruition, I want to say 5 or so years ago. I remember seeing it a lot whenever I was newer into the gym scene and consuming this type of content.
Yeah, so what I'd say to this is he has a point. I think a lot of people do conflate strength training and powerlifting. What I would say to this is training for strength doesn't necessarily mean you're optimizing your training for hypertrophy. So you can get stronger however you want, but that doesn't necessarily mean it is stimulative in a hypertrophic sense. So when you're training for strength, most people will see that as you're training for performance on whatever lift you want and whatever rep range you want. And that's what most people would refer to as general strength. That's what I would call general strength. So that could be a preacher curl in the 8 to 10 rep range. That could be a bench press in the 1 to 2 rep range, which basically would technically be powerlifting. But whatever you're training for performance in a specific movement is not optimal for hypertrophy, because if you're training for performance, you're not optimizing your technique to maximize muscular stimulus. You're doing whatever you can to have the best performance on paper. So whether that's speeding up your eccentric, cutting out parts of the range of motion where you can, using a little bit of bounce at the bottom of lifts that would be counterproductive to use a little bit of cheat on, things like this, when you're training for performance, are counterproductive for hypertrophy. You could talk about training for muscular strength. So you have, let's say you're training to just get your muscle as strong as possible. That's basically hypertrophy training, but I don't think people see that as strength training, because ultimately that just would be hypertrophy training.
But essentially what would be promoted is focusing on the bench and the squat and the deadlift, maybe the overhead press, maybe some other variations too. What it really boils down to, and if you have used or seen my programs, I do a template that's relatively similar to this. I don't call for maxing out. I don't think it's necessary to do that unless you just want to. But you're going to focus on the bench, the squat, and the deadlift, kind of the core barbell lifts, typically for lower reps and less volume, and then you're going to do the hypertrophy work. That is what power building training, broad scope, that's what it really comes down to, and that is ultimately how a lot of powerlifters train. This is another huge misconception. Guys on the internet...
Yeah, and that's what power building is. And that's fine. If you want to power build, you can power build. But let's not sit here and act like doing anything between 1 and 4 reps on squat, bench, deadlift, where you're incentivized to use a technique that allows you to put up the most performance, because after all, it is the powerlifting part of the power building, while you're accumulating a lot of fatigue, especially if you're trying to get to an advanced level or elite level natural bodybuilding physique. Let's not act like that's not going to interfere with your results. It certainly will.
Especially the hypertrophy cells. They believe that powerlifters are just walking into the gym, they do a bunch of 1-rep maxes on the bench, squat, and deadlift, and they leave. You guys have evidently never spent time in powerlifting gyms. You probably don't even know any powerlifters yourselves. Like, the amount of sheer Reddit conjecture about this topic is crazy. We're going to talk more about that conjecture coming up soon. But the idea that powerlifters only do those 3 lifts and they leave, it doesn't even add up, okay? Go watch any powerlifter train. Go even look at some of these people's Instagram pages. You're going to see them doing what is called accessory work. What does that mean? It really boils down to hypertrophy training. Because after they do their main lifts, and even so, guys, keep in mind, even if you're doing only 2 hard sets of deadlift, that is still going to put muscle on you. Now you can argue, okay, is it as effective as XYZ other exercise? That's fine. But you're still going to grow muscle doing squats, deadlifts, bench presses, all the classic kind of stuff.
Yeah, so of course you will build some muscle. I don't disagree with him on that. And yeah, I like that he pointed out that you can make the case that there are just better options for hypertrophy. And that's exactly what I'd say is there are better options for hypertrophy. So if you're training purely for hypertrophy, that's something you should be doing. But in this context, he kind of makes fun of people that train for hypertrophy. He literally calls them hypertrophy cells. He said that a handful of times already, and we're only 5 minutes in, and he's probably going to repeat saying that word over and over, which will steer people like my younger self away from actually training for hypertrophy. And when I talk about self-limiting content, this would have limited me in the past. One, because he's advocating against going purely for hypertrophy training, which I think would hold you back from achieving an advanced or elite physique naturally. And then he also kind of shames training for hypertrophy, which is another thing that if someone genuinely wants to just train for hypertrophy, of course they're going to get stronger. Of course, you're building general strength by just building muscle tissue. But you don't have to care about strength. And if you don't care about strength, you're ultimately chasing an empty and worthless goal for you. I spent so much time doing that, and I lost so much progress, and I grew resentful to the gym because I was going in and doing something I hated and got no fulfillment out of. It took a while to kind of repair that and get back into pure hypertrophy training. And since then, luckily, I've been able to do that. And luckily, I have this opportunity to speak about my experience and have other people relate and listen to it. But yeah, I mean, it's content like this. Like if I was to watch this video, this is pretty similar to what I was seeing a few years back when I kind of got sucked into the wrong ways of training for me personally. So I just want to have people kind of be aware of videos like this. And for some people, this is absolutely what they need to see. But it's definitely not the best content for everybody, in my opinion. I think there's a lot of people that do train for bodybuilding, and when they don't compete and when they don't care about strength, they're kind of just being mocked by this video, which I don't appreciate at all.
And this is what a lot of people don't understand either, man, because again, you guys are so enamored with the aesthetic culture, everybody being lean all the time and being shirtless. You think these dudes on the internet, all the aesthetic bras, you think they actually are as big in person as they appear online. So say you come across 2 Instagram accounts. The first is a popular aesthetics bra, and he's got the deep fried picture taken with a 4K camera, all edited up. It's been ran through Lightroom and Photoshop. Another filter's been put on it. It's from the perfect angle. They took it 100 times. He's got his abs. He looks very good. So you see him and you think, oh, that guy looks really big, man. He's got a lot of muscles because he's lean, right? Then you see a powerlifter that is smoking him on lifts of pretty much every category you could think of, but the powerlifter is recording themselves from 10 feet away so they can fit all of the bar and the plates into the video. They are without question going to be higher body fat in the vast majority of cases, and they're not posturing for the camera. There's no perfect angles and all this other stuff. They just set their thing up and they go. Who do you think is going to look bigger upon first sight? But then think of what I just said. The powerlifter is torching the aesthetic bra on all these exercises. So even if he does not appear bigger right off of the first glance, if you put these two together, the powerlifter, not only would he be thicker, he'd be wider. There's obviously going to be some height differences depending on who you're talking about. But the fact that you guys believe the powerlifters are somehow lacking in all this muscle mass because they do power building or they don't only train for hypertrophy, it shows how little you actually know. I go to gyms with serious powerlifters.
Okay, so now he's saying that the people that train purely for hypertrophy and pretend to be bigger than they are through deep frying their pictures, using a perfect camera, downloading pump, etc., photoshopping in some cases, he's saying that these people would get mogged by powerlifters. And to that I would say these people just aren't training properly, obviously. So it's not a fair comparison when you take the most muscular top-end powerlifters and say these guys are bigger than early intermediate lifters that pretend to be bigger than they are. That's not a fair comparison. I say a fair comparison, take the top end, biggest natural bodybuilders out there who Revival believes are basically fake natties, and then compare them to the top end natural powerlifters out there. This is where you start to see the differences. The top end natural bodybuilders mog the top end natural powerlifters. There are powerlifters that can be just as jacked as some of the bodybuilders in some areas for sure. And there are some powerlifters that respond well to it, and they do a good job of training their accessory work, quote unquote, and they're genetically gifted and they can get away with training like that and get elite in both ways, and that's fine. But the top end bodybuilders all have well-rounded, complete elite physiques, and that's something that if you want to train for that, you should train how these guys train. But then when he looks at how we look and train, he calls us fake natties. So he's limiting himself. You can't have your cake and eat it too.
Them. And they are not small people, the men or the women. These guys have gigantic turkey legs, they have big hamstrings, they have big backs, big forearms. Their chests, once again, are not going to be as defined typically because of the higher body fat. But anybody who's benching well over 300 pounds does not have a small chest. It simply does not work that way. And this might be the best part because the hypertrophy cells are like, oh, well, he might be really strong, but I still look better. I'll tell you what, bro, if these powerlifters cut down, and when they do, and there are numerous examples of this, both men and women, who start out as powerlifters, or maybe they do powerlifting in their off-season, then they do bodybuilding as they get leaner, they kind of rotate back and forth between them. These powerlifters, man, once they finally cut down, I don't care if you're talking natural or enhanced, in a lot of the cases, you could even say the vast majority of cases, they have more overall muscle mass than the guys obsessed with only hypertrophy. A common phrase...
I strongly disagree with that. Like I said, the top natural bodybuilders are always going to be more jacked, especially all around, than the top natural powerlifters. It just is what it is. If you want to maximize your muscular potential, you have to train for hypertrophy as your primary goal. If hypertrophy is always going to be secondary to your powerlifting or strength training, then you're not in control of how your physique develops. If you look at the top natural bodybuilders, most of them don't squat with a barbell. Most of them don't bench with a barbell. They use pretty much exclusively machines. They do some deadlift variations, or at least barbell row variations, but they don't even do the big three. And these guys are much bigger than the top natural powerlifters in most cases.
In bodybuilding is that shows are won from the back. If you had to guess, as a general rule, who has more developed posterior chains? All of it. Lats, traps, low back, glutes, hamstrings. Is it going to be the aesthetic hypertrophy guys who say, oh, well, squats are not optimal and deadlifts are just not a good hypertrophy exercise? Bent over rows and too much low back involvement, not stable enough? Or are the people who squat and deadlift in some capacity, if not doing other heavy back and leg movements on a weekly basis? But I don't compete in bodybuilding, so I don't care about what you just said.
Yeah, and this is just another thing where he's comparing the wrong things. Bodybuilders, the people that are trying to develop their entire body, like the top natural bodybuilders, do lifts that optimally target each muscle. Revival even said this himself earlier. He said you don't necessarily have to squat, bench, and deadlift. There are more optimal lifts out there for specific muscle groups. So a bodybuilder is going to pick the movements that are more optimal for the muscle group they're trying to train, that train it as a prime mover and directly. So I don't get the point that he's trying to make here. He's contradicting himself a bit.
Okay, point taken, that's fine. But what if I told you that people who compete in bodybuilding, many of whom have IFBB pro cards, some of them on the Olympia level in the top 5 in their classes, what if I told you that they still do power lifts? And not only that they do them for low reps? Because whether you compete in bodybuilding or not, and a lot of you guys still claim you're bodybuilders even though you don't, the ultimate goal of the recreational lifter who optimizes hypertrophy or the bodybuilder both want the most amount of muscle possible. So you would think, oh, well, there's no way that these bodybuilders would be doing the power lifts because they're not optimal for hypertrophy. Check the screen right now. I'm going to overlay a handful of people. I'm actually going to include some women too, because I know that's going to really piss some of you guys off. You can see their accounts, you can check their pages if you don't believe me. They all do the power lifts, if not outright maxing out in some capacity. And once again, I'm sure people are going to misconstrue what I'm saying. I think it's on purpose at this point because this is pretty clear, I think. They're going to say, oh, Revival says you should be maxing out and doing the power lifts. You have to do them to get really big. I never said that, guys. All I'm saying is, so many people now say that doing these lifts is detrimental to hypertrophy, and you're going to lose gains and suffer and all this stuff. It's going to be, too fatiguing, you can't do your other volume properly. That's not the case. These are just a few examples. I can find many, many more. This video could go on for hours and hours of just these examples. That is evidently not the case. If that was the case, all these people who are doing the power lifts and maxing out, again, these are IFBB pros, high-ranking, Olympia caliber, a lot of them, they would not be where they were if what you guys claim is actually true. That the power lifts and strength training and all this other stuff are so detrimental to building size. And now, of course, the response is going to be this. Oh, well, everybody you just showed is on a bunch of steroids, bro. That doesn't count. We're talking about natural lifters. And natural lifters, they need... Once again, you can't even prove all these people that claim natural are natural. There's no way to do it. You guys just believe everybody at face value. We used to know this a number of years ago. Before the hypertrophy cells overtook every aspect of lifting content, we used to know this. If you want to get big as a natural, you also need to get strong. The only people...
Yeah, so he can make fun of that argument all he wants. He can mock that voice. He can mock what someone like me would normally say, and that's fine, but that doesn't make him correct. Every example he gave was somebody on gear. Maybe there was one person in there that wasn't on gear, but to me, visually, extremely obvious. Those are a handful of people that I actually knew of that openly admit that they're on gear. He's also talking about IFBB pros. So you're talking about people that have an enhanced recovery capacity that are injecting drugs into their body that, one, yeah, enhance their recovery, give them more energy. It's a different ball game. And I'm not saying like naturals, oh, you're just weak and frail and you can't train hard and you can only do one set per movement. It's like, no, you guys know I advocate against that mindset, obviously. But at the same time, let's see some natural examples. And the top natural bodybuilders, I'll say it a third time, are going to be bigger than the top natural powerlifters. And the top natural bodybuilders generally don't do the big three. It's a lot of machine work. Yeah, some of it's heavy, some of it isn't with the most strict, perfect form, but whatever they do, they know what they're doing to optimize their hypertrophic stimulus out of that lift. They cheat when they need to, they do whatever lifts they need to target the muscle that they're trying to target.
Well, this really is an exception for are the people that are juicing. And as I just showed you, plenty of people who are juicing, even on heavy amounts, they still are very strong. The only scenario you're going to find somebody with these big bulging muscles and they're so jacked, but then they're not nearly as strong on main exercises as you would think they are. Yeah, we used to have a term for that. It's called a juice head. That is only achievable through not just a little bit, that is a lot of anabolic use.
So I disagree with this, because if you don't need the big three to get super jacked, then you might not necessarily have a good big three total when you're very strong, or when you're very big, my bad. Look at someone like GVS, again, going back to that same example that he was implying in this video and that he talked about in the comments. Someone like him, I don't even know what his powerlifting total was, but I'm basically, no, I am certain that it was less than mine, yet he mogs me, or at least at the time. He's still bigger than me now, but if you compare when I was at my peak powerlifting total to his physique absolutely mogged mine, and my powerlifting total absolutely mogged his. And yeah, of course, the more size that you build up, the more strength potential you have, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be technically efficient in the squat, bench, and deadlift. For example, if a bodybuilder mostly trains on machines or something like that, they can still get absurdly jacked and reach their potential that they can hit. But if they're not trained in the squat, bench, deadlift, their numbers aren't going to be that impressive. Strength is also leverages too. So if you take someone like GVS, who's obviously the example he talked about earlier in this video, someone like him benches, no more than 300, yet he has the best triceps in natural YouTube, and obviously his chest is very impressive too. You get into these situations where now someone like him, because of this misconception, is looked at as a fake natty just because he doesn't have a huge total. But in reality, he has the muscle mass to potentially have a big total, but he either doesn't train and or doesn't have the leverages to actually put up an impressive total. So that's where it becomes a little bit of a misconception in my mind.
And in some cases, too, those people might actually be pinning like oil, I think it's called PMMA injections, if not outright synthol, into their muscles to make them look much bigger. But that is the only conceivable scenario. These guys used to be universally laughed at by all serious gym goers, and now they're celebrated. Like, that's how much the tide has turned. And of course, said guys, fanboys, and associates, they're going to defend him, and they're going to give him the self-assurance, like, oh, you're not that weak, bro, it's okay, well, he's just built different, he's unique, he trains differently. Once again, these guys, if they had no associations or ties with the dude, they would be mocking him.
Okay, now, at this point, he's just projecting his own insecurity in my mind. So the way I see this, whether it's his insecurity or not, he thinks that everybody that trains purely for hypertrophy is just coping because they're somehow not strong. I don't understand this, because it seems like he doesn't understand that someone can care about hypertrophy and not care about strength. Look at myself. I'm a great example of this, where I got very good numbers, better than Revival's numbers, at a lighter body weight and probably 6 or 7 years younger than him. I didn't care. I still got big numbers. I still hit a 330 pause bench, 455 squat to depth, 600 plus pound deadlift. I deadlifted 500 for 10. And those are great numbers. All at 182 pounds. I wasn't even old enough to drink a beer yet. Okay? Like, I've done it before. I've walked the walk. And I did not care. I resented the gym. I had tiny little arms. I had tiny calves. No abs. Like, no quads. Like, the muscles that look good on a bodybuilder and the muscles that I cared to grow didn't grow. And that's a problem, because I'm missing the point of what I'm there for. And that's something that he has to understand, is that other people can have different goals and not everybody cares about strength. Some people are just okay with being big and not having or expressing their strength potential. And that's fine. He doesn't seem to understand that. So to me, it just looks like he's either projecting an insecurity that he might have about his strength levels, or he just doesn't comprehend that some people just don't care about strength, yet they care about size. And I've talked about this before. The psychology behind each goal it's very different. Hypertrophy in bodybuilding is trying to build your physique so you look good outside of the gym. It's an aesthetic. It's a steady state. It's a state of being is the way I'd put it. Performance is more like a sport, so training for strength, no matter how similar it is to hypertrophy training, if you care about strength, the gym is where you perform. If you care about powerlifting, which is similar in terms of performance but different in terms of training to, say, general strength training, the gym is the highlight of your day. That's where you go to perform, and that's fine. But he doesn't seem to understand that there is a major difference between those two goals. Not necessarily so much and so drastic in terms of the actual training itself. They're small but significant differences. But the psychological difference between each pursuit is a very big difference in my mind. And I hope you guys can understand that.
They would say, dang, that guy's really weak for his size. That's kind of embarrassing. But because they want to stay in his good graces, it's all smiles and claps and reassurance. But those are two very common arguments.
Okay, so that's an indirect shot at GVS, I think. I did see that earlier, and I did see a few people call that out in the comments. Yeah, again, he just doesn't understand that some people don't care about strength, and that's fine.
Still here when it comes to this topic, the differentiation, allegedly, of size and strength. They'll say, oh, well, this guy's really big, but he's not that strong. Or, oh, well, this guy's really small, but he's super strong. The level to which a lot of you don't understand basic statistics is kind of scary. So I get variations of this comment all the time. There's going to be many of them down below in this video. Guys will say, oh, well, we know there's a lot of powerlifters with underwhelming physiques, not that much muscle mass. They lift a ton of weight. Here's how you can nuke this argument in seconds. It completely makes it go belly up. Every time you see a comment like this, here's how to respond. Name 5. As I mentioned earlier.
Interesting. So obviously this is a situation where with your own two eyes, you can obviously see that powerlifters' physiques aren't nearly as impressive as top bodybuilders' physiques. I would say someone like myself is a perfect example of that. Even Alex Leonidas, to an extent, he had a very well-rounded physique for the most part, but even someone like him got elite numbers in movements that do train the arms indirectly. So I think he had a 4-plate weighted chin-up, which people claim is incredible for the biceps, and then he had a 4-plate bench too, which is nuts. And his arms were only 16.5 inches. And I say only as in someone with numbers like that, like Revival would say, you would assume they should have the huge arms that are probably peak natural arms, since he's so much stronger than every other natural in those movements. They should be 19 inches, right? Not necessarily. So that's where strength and size do have their differences. And then someone like myself, where I don't think I was as strong performance-wise as Alex Leonidas at this point, but I had pretty impressive numbers, and my arms were only 16 inches. So you can also talk about other examples like a powerlifter by the name of Ben Poor. I hate to call somebody out for this, but I think he's a great example. I think he has either 2,000 is his powerlifting total, or just about 2,000. His physique, I would say, isn't as impressive as any of the noble natties. He just has like an intermediate bodybuilding physique. He looks good. He has a good physique. But if you use the logic that strength and size are perfectly correlated, it's a little bit obvious which is more underwhelming. And of course, the three of us are natural. There's another not natural example where if you look at Mr. Blowho, he actually has 16-inch arms, and he's one on gear, been training for, I think, over 25 years, has a pretty solid powerlifting total, and his arms are still 16 inches. And it's not like he's even lean. Like, he's bulked up well over 200 pounds. His arms are still 16 inches. So that's another example of the deficiencies of powerlifting / power building. And he claims that he power builds. So that's another example. And not to call him out in particular, because I just don't like calling people out. But if he's going to ask for examples, then yeah, I'll provide a couple.
Earlier, I don't want to hear this Reddit conjecture. I want actual names and or accounts. I want to see these mythical people that have barely any muscle mass, terrible physiques, but they're so insanely strong. Here's how it's going.
Again, my entire channel is built upon this entire thing. And it's not like I'm some weird outlier. Like, I'm just a normal guy. People even say I have good genetics. So it's a perfect example myself.
ago. They'll say, the skinny Asian guy that benches 400, that happened like 8 years ago at this point. That's all they got. Sure, you can look it up and you might be able to find a few more examples. But even so, if you can name 5, congratulations, you named 5 lifters. Even if you could compile a list of dozens of powerlifters who are much stronger than they look, and that's also still relative ultimately, because of the factors we talked about earlier, that is still a fraction, a tiny fraction, of the overall populace of those lifters. And the fact alone that we say this guy is way stronger than he looks and it's a big deal, that proves the point. Because we innately know that the bigger people are, in almost every single case, always going to lift more weight. And even so, if the small people with the underwhelming physiques built more muscle, guess what? For their own genetics and potential, they would still get stronger. And when it comes to this guy's really jacked, but he's not as strong as he looks, a lot of these guys online are not as big as you think. A lot of the hypertrophy guys at this point are editing their pictures, not just with filters and Lightroom and that type of thing, they're genuinely photoshopping their pictures to give themselves bigger muscles, okay? They're pulling out the edges so their arms and shoulders pop out more, they draw their waist in. Some people make this too obvious, others are pretty darn good at it. A common example are women whenever they post their booty pictures and they make their waist really, really small and their butt curves out, kind of egregiously wide. It's ultimately the same thing. But once again, you see this stuff at a quick glance, you don't really analyze the picture, you're not going to notice this. You're just going to be like, oh my god, that guy's so jacked. That's amazing. Like.
Yeah, so another good example that he brings up here that I disagree with, he's making fun, again, of these people that just pretend to be bigger than they are online, but then he attacks people like myself who try and show like a legit physique and legit normal lighting without a fancy camera, without a fancy pump or anything, and all of a sudden we're either fake natties or we don't exist. And what I'd say to this is he talks about people that don't look as impressive as what their strength would be. I don't think this is necessarily the best way to look at it. I would say look at the people that are very strong, look at the powerlifters, and then look at bodybuilders with maybe a similar training age or a similar height or similar genetics overall, and compare their physiques, because that is one example of a guy that's maybe trained for X amount of years in bodybuilding and a guy that's trained for X amount of years in powerlifting, and see who looks better. Every time, pretty much, it's going to be the bodybuilder. And of course, there are genetic variables where there is, of course, going to be some overlap, and a powerlifter does look better in some cases. The vast majority of the time, the bodybuilders look better, especially when you get to the high-end guys. They have to train very specialized, and they have to do exactly what works for them. And speaking from experience, as someone that did plateau relatively quickly with a power building type plan in terms of size, I had to specialize from a very early age, training-wise, to actually get my physique to where it is now. There's no way my physique would be where it is now if I didn't switch to pure hypertrophy training. It would either take much, much, much longer, or I straight up just wouldn't get there. Again, Alex Leonidas is another good example of someone that got much stronger than I got, and his arms were still only 16 and a half. Now, I took my arms from 16 to now 17 and a half from training them properly, like how the bodybuilders actually do.
And on top of that too, do not discount the lengths that these guys will go to take picture after picture after picture after video after video after video after picture of themselves. So what a lot of these guys do is they are addicted to junk volume as it is. So they go do their junk volume pump for their arms. I watched this happen, guys, in my gym about a month ago. There was some influencer guy in there. The dude is completely yoked. He's got huge muscles. I believe he's a powerlifter. Can you believe that? But he was doing a little photo shoot for some product. I watched him go to the cable station. He would do a superset of tricep extensions, like pushdowns, and then curls. Why? He kept his biceps and triceps, his arms pumped, because he kept retaking these pictures. He would do his superset, he'd go over, he'd sit there and posture with the thing, his friend would take pictures, they'd look at it, I don't like those. He'd go back, get his pump again, and they just kept repeating this process. I'm not kidding, it lasted over a half an hour. But this is far more common than you might realize. This is what so many guys do before they take quick little videos or posing videos or photos of themselves. They get a gigantic pump, maybe they have a giant meal beforehand or whatever they're gonna do, so they may look really big in that split moment, and of course they're going to be under the perfect down lighting. This is ultimately enhanced even more so, the leaner that you are because your muscles pop more, your skin is tighter. There's all these factors that go into it. But if you saw this person in a candid picture, even if they're halfway flexing, like kind of midway through doing a lift, they're not going to look remotely as close as they do.
Okay, so to this, he makes a couple good points, and there are, again, a couple things I disagree with. So with this point, again, he's comparing like the failed bodybuilders to the powerlifters that have success, and that's not an equal comparison. You could make the same exact case using the same logic, just switching the two sides, saying, well, look at all these intermediate powerlifters that are completely plateaued at a mid-200s bench, and the bodybuilders would just mog them in a powerlifting meet because they're so much bigger. And that's completely valid. It's the same exact logic. So you have to compare apples to apples. You can't just waste all this time comparing apples to oranges. One thing I do strongly agree with him on is that there are guys, and a lot of these guys on social media that are your kind of run-of-the-mill influencers, the tactics they use are absurd to make themselves appear bigger than they actually are. And these are the guys that you have to watch out for. They're the guys that have the crazy pumps. They're the guys that have the perfect cameras. They all have the same exact, like, perfect lighting. I'll never figure out how to do it, but it's like the perfect downlighting that's super dim and super dark, but it makes all their muscles pop out. And generally, these are kids too. These are teenagers for the most part, or guys in their early 20s, and they just don't have the muscle mass yet. Of course, they're young. They haven't been training for long enough. So I'd say, yeah, there's some of these guys that just do junk volume, like you said, train for the fluff and pump, and they get a huge pump, take these perfect pictures, make themselves appear bigger than they actually are. But I'd say there's probably a fair share of these guys that probably are training properly and are just early on in their process. Yeah, they look bigger than they are on social media, they look bigger on social media than they are in real life. But a lot of these people, since they do generally tend to be pretty young, I'm sure a lot of them do train successfully and do train properly, and it's just a matter of time before they do actually have a legit physique. But overall, a lot of these people, yeah, they do tend to be very kind of selfish, even narcissistic in a lot of cases too, which is crazy to say, but it is true. And that's where I think the value in a channel like mine, or a channel like the rest of the Noble Natties have, is extremely valuable, because it actually provides legit information on the training methods we use. It's information focused. It's not about the creator. It's about you guys. It's about the community. It's about what we're talking about. It's about training methods. That's all it is. That's value. And for him to imply that we're too big to be natural, we're fake natties, and that just defeats the whole purpose. Like, you can't attack both sides. And you can critique both sides if you have a critique against both sides. But for him to say these guys aren't as big as they seem, they're lying in all these tricks, doing all these tricks to make themselves look bigger than they are. We need people that actually are big and doing it properly and not lying about everything. And then we show up, we make our channels, and now he says, oh, they're too big to be natural, those guys are fake natties. Like, you can't pick both sides
in the staged pictures. So when you see one of these guys and their bulging muscles popping out, but then their lifts are not really even in the ballpark for what their size is, especially when it comes to the overall weight that they carry, they're not as big as you think, or how they portray themselves to be. And by the way, that crushes them deep down inside. That's why they're addicted to junk volume in the pump, because that's the only time their self-esteem is ever good. And since a lot of you are still probably not convinced, or at least you're still on the fence, like, bro, like, you're making good points, but, hypertrophy, let's go back to the golden era. Because even to this day, these are widely regarded as the most aesthetic and the most sought-after physiques for men. You see these type of comparisons on Instagram all the time, Arnold versus C-Bum. And even though C-Bum is the current reigning Mr. Classic, he's got all those followers, almost every single comment is going to be in favor of Arnold. And pretty much everybody would say that Frank Zane's physique is better than all of the top classic guys today. Which is funny, because a lot of these natural zealots, they'll put them in their thumbnails to get attention and clicks, even though they say all the steroid users are inherently bad people.
I disagree with that. I don't really think we use a whole ton of steroid users in our videos, unless it's about a specific steroid user, or a method maybe that person talked about. But generally, like, the thumbnails that we use are of ourselves because we have good physiques.
And a bad influence, except when they're getting you more clicks and eyeballs, I suppose. Not hypocritical at all. But even a physique like Steve Reeves.
Yeah, I don't know who he's talking about here. It seems like he's talking about the Noble Natties, but this just isn't. It's just not really the case.
If we want to keep this in the so-called natty attainable range, his physique is still widely desired today. So many guys would be thrilled to get to this point. Now let's put on our thinking caps. Despite all of their differences in height and weight and era, where they're from, their rep ranges, whatever it might be, what did these guys all have in common? They used the basic barbell exercises. Yes, many of them did all three power lifts, sometimes routinely. That was a huge portion of their training. This is what really cracks me up, man, because the guys that are still revered the most, even 50 plus years later, you can look at videos, at photos, at their training logs, at their books, all this other stuff. These guys talk about the basics constantly. They didn't have access to all these new machines and methods that we have today. They still had better physiques. Now, would these guys place in terms of bodybuilding at this point? No, they wouldn't, because the standards have become that much more extreme.
I kind of disagree with this too, because of course there's always going to be people that can just stick to the basics and get huge doing that. And to my knowledge, Steve Reeves did. Yeah, he used a lot of the basics, but he also trained every muscle group properly. And the reality is that not everybody's going to respond to training that way. You can have people, again, like myself, Alex Leonidas in the arms specifically, where we do the basics and we do them hard and we train them right and we push harder than the vast majority of people on them, but we don't get the bodybuilding results to show for it. And when you run into a plateau in bodybuilding, like, you're not guaranteed to just follow the basics forever and get to a Steve Reeves level physique. At some point, you are going to have to specialize to get there unless you're a genetic exception. And I would say someone like him is the exception. Why do you think most people don't have a physique like his? Is it because just nobody squats, benches, and deadlifts anymore? No, they're very prevalent lifts, but nobody can match that physique. I think it's because people are too dogmatic about this power building style training, and it holds them back. The top natural bodybuilders, yeah, a lot of them probably built their base doing squat, bench, deadlifts because that's just what was popular at the time. There's no evidence to show that they're superior lifts to anything else, as long as you're picking a good lift, of course. Like, you can't just swap out something like a Pendlay row, for example, for like some weird little rear delt variation, expect it to work the same. Like, you still have to actually look at resistance profiles and just how hard you can push that lift, how stable that lift is. Like, exercise selection still matters. You can't just do a gimmicky little lift and expect it to work the same as maybe one of the more basic lifts. But at some point, to become a top natural bodybuilder, you have to get into more specific training. You can't just rely on the basics. Like I said, and I'll say it again, some people can get away with the basics, and that's fine. The vast majority of people do not have the genetics to be able to do that, and you have to specialize, and you have to get a little bit more fine-tuned with your training. And there's like some weird, like, I don't know if it's like a masculinity like fantasy or something that people have, but people get so like emotionally tied to being like minimalistic and like, oh, I'm super manly, I just do this, I only do squat, bench, deadlift, I'm all tough, just 5x5. And to like have any type of critical thinking in your training or think about things on a slightly deeper level, you're just like, oh, you're overthinking, you're overcomplicating. Like, any other pro athlete is so fine-tuned and so customized with their performance and their routine and how they go about their craft. But as soon as it comes to bodybuilding, everyone's like, oh, just the basics, anything above the basics, you're overthinking, you're wasting your time, it's fluff and pump, it's gimmicky. Like, I don't know what it is. I think there's some people that overthink their training and just don't train hard, but that doesn't mean you have to ruin it for the rest of us. Like, there are people that train hard that still need to customize their training and think about it at a little bit of a deeper level. And there's a lot of examples of that. I named a few already.
But pretty much everybody watching here, the vast, overwhelming majority of you, would love to look like these guys did. Or even if you're a natty zealot, you want to get the natural version of this, or whatever you think is natural. And even in the modern era, I did an old video reacting to Chris Bumstead in that interview. The guy asked him, what are the top 10 exercises for...
Yeah, that would be cool. I'd love to... I mean, I'm not going to like chase another guy's physique. I think that's weird. But if Steve Reeves has 18.5-inch arms, I have to specialize to do that. I would love to look like Steve Reeves, but I'm sorry. If you think that I want to achieve this physique, that proves my point even further, that I have to specialize even more. If I want 18.5-inch arms, I have to do very specific lifts that I respond well to, like a preacher curl and like a Smith machine JM press. I've tried so many other things for so long, and this is just what works for me. So yeah, it's not a basic lift. A Smith machine JM press with an extreme stretch and a narrow grip with a pause at the bottom in the 10 to 14 rep range, that's not basic. But if I actually want to look like these guys, that doesn't mean that their training method is necessarily what works for me.
Building muscle. And he goes on to name the basic template of starting strength. He's like, squats, deadlifts, bench press, pull-ups. I mean, seriously, man, you can look through all of these guys, no matter the era, current, back in the day, way back in the day, whatever the case is. The basics are always a cornerstone of these people's training, but we're supposed to believe now that it's like, oh, well, you can't do those exercises, they're not good, and the Smith machine version is always going to be better, and this machine version's always going to be better, and low reps are bad. Even though Franco Columbu was a great powerlifter, Arnold was a great powerlifter, Ronnie Coleman was a great powerlifter. I mean, you guys are so out of touch, it's kind of ridiculous. And even if you still want to hang your hat on the natty argument, like, oh, we're using these juice heads as an example, once again, you can never prove that the natural, so-called, are actually natural, that's just how it goes. But if you want to hang your hat there, you can find this on Instagram too, guys. The vast majority. Yeah,
so again, he's just saying that, oh, well, if you can't prove people are natural, then you can't really trust it. So again, he's shooting himself in the foot. I genuinely think it's sad that he thinks the noble natties in like our corner of YouTube are not natural. That's very disappointing, very nihilistic, and not in the sense that if someone thinks that any of us are fake natties, it's like yeah, that like I don't care if you damage my reputation or convince other people that someone like me is a fake natty, but you're limiting yourself and you're limiting the people that you say this to. You're making people doubt their ability to trust who's natural and who's not. And I think it's very obvious that if you spend time on a channel like mine or something similar to it, that we are actually natural because we have a very good understanding of training. We're very passionate about training, and when we showcase this knowledge and then showcase a physique that isn't even peak natural in my own case. I'm not even there yet. I still have a ways to go, but something that is overall pretty impressive. Like, what do you want? What do you want us to do?
Of the top natural physiques, these guys are still very strong. Even if they're not doing bench squat and deadlift, if they're doing Romanian deadlifts, if they're doing incline bench, if they're doing some other variation of the squat, they're not in any circumstance going to be weak on those exercises. These are rare outliers, no matter which side you're talking about. Oh, the small guy, allegedly, that's insanely strong. Outlier. Oh, the really jacked guy that's allegedly really weak, or the allegedly really jacked guy who is weak. Outlier. A lot of you guys don't understand the bell curve at all. You guys think you can use these 1 in 10,000 examples as ironclad proof that the exception to the rule is going to work for you and everybody else. And I hate to tell you, but it is not. So if you are looking for a program that you could consider power...
Yeah, so I think he's just selling programs or something now. I think the video is over. But basically, he has a good point to finish off the video that I agree with him on. It doesn't have to necessarily be the squat, bench, deadlift, but that kind of just defeats his whole argument about needing to do something a little bit more specific. So, yeah, I mean, I feel like he wasted a little bit of time with that, but I do respect what he says there. It can be an RDL, it can be an incline bench or whatever. That's totally fine, but it's not necessarily power building anymore because those aren't the power lifts. So, yeah, I guess with that being said, that one kind of caught me off guard, but that's all I got for today. If you guys have any other questions or anything, let me know. I will see you guys in the next one.